So on this podcast, we've got Alex Markham. So I met Alex last year speaking at an event in London, and I really liked Alex's talk, so I actually wanted him to get on this podcast. So I actually opened up the talk to him so he could decide what he wanted to talk about. So we're going to talk a little bit about sort of spirituality and oneself, loving yourself, self-compassion, and centeredness. So welcome, Alex.
Hello, how are you doing?
I'm pretty good, mate, pretty good. So it'd be great if we could sort of have a bit about your background, really, mate, where you came from and how you sort of got into this side of, what you do.
Yeah, sure. Okay, so a good place to start. I mean, the truth is that it's kind of a journey, the kind of journey into having compassion for oneself is a journey that I think everybody, in a sense, is on. But I'm gonna, so I've, in a sense, been on the journey for my whole life. But a good sort of pinch point, if you like, a turning stage, was after I left university, which was about 8 years ago. And I found myself single, and I was living in London, and I just sort of realized that I was really lonely. One of the weird things about living in a big city is that it's actually often very easy to feel lonely when you're surrounded by lots of other people who all seem to be having a great time, have lots of friends or girlfriends. And I had a few friends, but I was definitely wishing I was in relationships and things like this. And so I kind of had to take a look and start to really take a kind of careful look at my life. I reached a point where I was, I guess, just things were getting a bit desperate. And when oftentimes we find that those are the moments in our lives when we kind of have to make or break, and we have to kind of make a decision that actually something's going to shift and something's going to change. And so that's when I started looking more kind of carefully or meticulously at my life, and that included kind of all my daily habits. And one of the things that I discovered, that I sort of picked up on, was meditation. And I began to meditate, and I found that if I wasn't meditating during the day, at some stage, usually in the mornings, that I would find myself getting, if I did meditate, I found that I was much more forgiving of other people, I was much more relaxed, and my days were just better. And I reached a point where if I wasn't meditating for a few days at a time, then I'd really notice how much it was kind of stressing me out. Now, from this, I started to get a kind of greater sense of, shall we say, centeredness. But more than that, I also started to notice all the ways in which I kind of wasn't centered in my daily life, and I wasn't being myself. And I hadn't even realized that for the previous 20 years. I'd not registered or recognized that in my daily life I wasn't always being true to myself. I was being pulled in kind of all different directions by these desires, essentially, that I was carrying around with me. The desire, in my case, it manifests still to this day. It manifests as a desire for relationships, girlfriends, and a desire for fame, and kind of celebrity. But what I've learned over the years, over the past 8 years of working with this and meditating, is that one can relinquish these things and reach a point where they don't have to dominate your daily life. And you can actually come into the recognition that you are okay just as you are, that you don't need anything else to be confident, content within yourself and happy. But at the time when I started meditating, this was still kind of a fairly long way off. And I combine this with a lot of things that a lot of your listeners probably involved with, like just trying to improve my social life, trying to improve my dating life. And over a few years, I worked on this, and I became reasonably successful with it. And I wound up running a business in London, which was assisting people, coaching people in self-confidence, dating, these sorts of things. And what I found was, time and time again, that what had worked for me also was working for all the people that I was working with. And principally, the main thing that it all came back to was this sense of being okay as you are. I think a lot of the people listening today will understand kind of the term neediness, and what it, to a certain extent, will understand what it means to be needy. But oftentimes we have to kind of step back and really reflect in a relationship, even if it's just going and chatting to somebody new in a bar. How am I trying to force this person to like me for one reason or another? How am I trying to change myself so that they'll like me? And that's a needy behavior. That's a behavior that's grounded on the fundamental misconception that you are not good enough as you are. So actually, an attractive man, an attractive behavior, is always grounded in a real, genuine sense that whether this person likes me or not doesn't impact whether I like myself. It's not part of the equation, if you like. I am perfectly fine just as I am. So I ran this business, and we were very well received by our clients. We had a lot of really great kind of success stories, if you like. And then I kind of decided to move. I moved away from London, and I got involved in other kinds of activities. But I still do coaching, and I still do speaking of this variety. But all the way, every step of the way, it's been about returning to a deeper sense of what Buddhists would call mindfulness, of being centered and present in what I'm doing right now. So even when I'm talking to you now, I'm trying to be aware of where I am and how I feel right in this moment, rather than projecting too far into the future or the past. It's a common enough kind of process that we hear about from all kinds of different directions within spirituality, of being in the present. But it's something that I've learned to develop over 8 years. And it's something that I think there's something that really needs to be emphasized, which is kind of overlooked a lot amongst people, and maybe overlooked by your listeners, which is that this being in the present thing is something that people literally dedicate their entire lives to. If you imagine a kind of Zen monk living in a monastery and spending 10 hours of every day in meditation, and these people exist, these people have existed in the past, and yet those same people would still say that they have further to go, that they have work, there's still work to be done. So the reason I'm saying this is because a difficulty that a lot of people face, a really common problem that I encounter, is I'll meet somebody and they'll say, well, I can't meditate because I sit down, I try to empty my mind, and it doesn't work. It doesn't empty. There's a common description of meditation, which is that it's like taming a wild elephant, or sometimes taming a wild monkey. And you have to imagine what that's like. That's kind of what the mind is. It's like an enraged elephant that runs from one topic to another and is constantly trying to reach out into the future or return to the past. And it's not just our mind, not just yours and mine, but it's really common. It's culturally the norm that this is how people's minds work. And since we exist in society and we're surrounded at all times by people who are thinking in this way, and all the media that we are subjected to is built on this kind of thinking and founded on the kind of desires of society. Obviously, coming into oneself and finding centeredness is something that requires a great deal of effort and time. The reason I say that is because on one hand, I don't want people to be put off if they don't have instant results, if you like. And on the other hand, but I want to really emphasize that if you are able to dedicate yourself to it, and it's something that you do put the time into, it brings rewards which are untold and ultimately come back to this deep, true sense of authentic well-being, which is the most attractive state that any man can be in.
Oh, wicked. So, just listen to you there speaking. What would you say the main difference is then between self-esteem and self-compassion? Are these two the same things? Are they kind of, do they run the same paths?
That's a great question. With all of this, there's a degree to which is kind of semantics, if you like. One person would define self-esteem one way, and another person would define it another way. But let me make a division which may be helpful for some of the people listening, which is simply that self-esteem is something that we can build, I think, through little victories. And if somebody wants to build their self-esteem, this is how I would always suggest they go about it. Set yourself small daily goals and work towards those goals. Make them a little bit out of your comfort zone, but still achievable. And try to build them into some kind of a plan moving towards a larger goal, so that if you do make these little daily achievements, ultimately you're moving towards this larger goal. One of the difficulties that we all face, kind of one of the tricks that we all kind of play on ourselves, is to move the goalposts, working towards a goal, and just when you're starting to approach reaching it, you decide actually there's this bigger goal that you really want to achieve, and this smaller goal it's not even important. And we constantly feel as though we're running up this down escalator, trying to get to the top. So to build self-esteem, set yourself something that, and I recommend this to everybody listening, set yourself a goal that you can probably achieve today. It could be just as simple as today I'm going to sit and meditate for half an hour, or it could be something like today I'm just going to get out of the house today. Sometimes that alone is hard enough. I'm just going to go to the pub. Even if nobody's going to come, I'm going to go and have a drink. And that's enough. And then if you say, okay, well, I did that today, tomorrow I'm going to go to the pub, I'm going to have a drink, and I'm going to strike up a conversation with the bartender. And if it only lasts for a minute, at least I've achieved that. And then the next day, I'm going to strike up a conversation with somebody else at the bar. I'm just going to give them a compliment. And if it passes in 10 seconds, that's fine. These little goals that you can achieve are what builds up this kind of sense of self-esteem. It's kind of like having a slideshow in your mind of all the successes that you have achieved. So that when you feel lacking in self-esteem, you have this kind of file of facts full of all these tiny thousands of little occasions where you did achieve something. And it reminds you that by putting one foot in front of the other, you eventually get further along your journey. So that's my kind of consideration of that side of things. Now, self-compassion is the partner to this. It's the kind of it's a necessary cohort, if you like. It's the thing that has to come with self-esteem, because self-compassion is exactly the same as self-forgiveness. And what that means is, if you set yourself this daily goal and you aren't able to do it for one reason or another, it doesn't happen, you say, quite simply, okay, I'll do it tomorrow. It's that this kind of double action, if you like, is a nice way to walk on a path that means that you're moving forward, but if you stumble, you're not blaming yourself. And that's where the self-compassion is. It's learning not to blame yourself. I would add something to this, which is that within that process, that process is extremely hard. I've been talking about centeredness, but this process of self-forgiveness, it's more or less means the same thing. It means letting go of any times when you feel you haven't lived up to your own standards.
So would you say that's moving from self-pity to forgiveness then? That's the difference in mindset?
Yeah, and also not just self-pity, but kind of self-flagellation, being angry at oneself. There are always times in our lives where we become angry at ourselves because we haven't achieved something or we've done something wrong. And self-forgiveness is saying, I'm gonna let go of that. I don't need to hold on to that. It's my decision ultimately whether I decide to be angry at myself right now or not, and I'm not going to. But I wanted to just add a small point, but an important point, which is that given that this is a hard thing to do and requires years of practice really to be able to do it consistently, if you find that you're not able to forgive yourself, then forgive yourself for that. Forgive yourself if there are certain things that if you find yourself getting angry at yourself from time to time, because it's very easy to get into a pattern of being angry at oneself for being angry at oneself. And this is a very difficult, this is a dark path, if you like. It's a vicious spiral. But it's somewhere along the chain, it's usually possible to shrug your shoulders and say, well, I am what I am. It is what it is. And that energy stops this cycle, allows you to move backwards into forgiveness, into saying, you know what, I did the best I could, and I'm still doing the best I can. And that's that. I'm not going to dwell on it or hold myself to some high, impossible standard. I'm just going to say, I am what I am. And there again, we come back to centeredness. I am what I am. I don't need anything further. Ultimately, I don't need to achieve anything in order to be able to feel compassion and compassion towards myself and well-being within myself.
Yeah, I mean, it's making me think of. There's been moments where maybe a couple of years ago I would have a negative opinion on something. So something could have happened, and it's the end of the world. This is terrible.
Yeah.
And I think the thing that I've learned is as a reframe. So you reframe everything as a positive. And I was talking to someone the other day about, if you lose your mobile phone, that's great. You get to get a new mobile phone.
Yeah, or you get to spend a little while without everybody being able to interrupt you whenever you're in the middle of something.
Yeah, and I think
it's quite nice not having a mobile phone for a little while.
Yeah, right. But yeah, this is kind of sounds similar where, to practice to get into the habit of, not forgiving yourself. So forgive yourself for that. So being positive in little steps throughout your daily life, it actually does change your whole perception of things. And at first you might think, I'm doing this, but I'm not really understanding it. I'm not really accepting of it, not believing it'd work. But if you're doing that every day in little amounts, it does change your whole perception of things, I think.
Yeah, and ultimately this is what it all comes back to. So when I sort of started to get interested in meeting people, socializing, dating, there was a lot of advice out there which was kind of what to say and when, what you should say in this scenario to these types of people. And I kind of turned my back on a lot of that fairly quickly because I came to realize that by learning a sequence of phrases, by learning some strategy for what to say, I was actually feeding into the belief that I wasn't enough just as I am, and that I couldn't communicate in a pretty confident way naturally. So for me, that entire journey has become one of these, as you say, daily little steps. And with that, it's I would recommend highly to everybody who's interested in this topic to keep a diary. And with my clients, I can't force people to keep a diary, but the ones that do come on 10 times faster. And the reason is that the entire process that we're talking about is one of self-reflection. It requires one to look at the activities and the thoughts that you've had through the course of the day. So if you're able to pause once or maybe multiple times during a day and make a note, just write down how you were feeling. Today I met this person, and it went quite well, but this and this happened, and that made me feel. And this is the important part. How did it make you feel, and what thoughts did you have? I felt this way, or I thought this way. Once you've written it down, it's not then a question of kind of beating yourself up because it isn't exactly how it should have been. It's much more a question of keeping these notes, looking back over the notes, recognizing when changes are happening, using these notes as opportunities to consider why you might be having these negative feelings or thoughts, where they originate from, and, as you said, how you can reframe them, how you can rethink them in a different way. What positives have come out of it. This is really important. If you write, something negative happens to you or to a person, inevitably positives come out of anything negative. It's always true. And the more that you notice that, you write down one day, oh, I got dumped, and then you write down 2 weeks later, oh, I met somebody new. Suddenly you realize, well, you wouldn't have met somebody new if you hadn't been dumped. Bad things always lead to good things. And that recognition starts to enable people to kind of change their perception gradually over time to see the good things. I recently met somebody when I was traveling who was essentially, in many respects, kind of a soulmate, if you like, kind of perfect for me. And we really got on and we were really connected. And for one reason or another, it didn't work out. And this is really hard, as I'm sure you can imagine, when you meet somebody that you really connect with and then it doesn't work out. And I think the old me would have really spent a long time kind of beating myself up for all the things I could have done differently. But the new me looks at it and says, well, this person lives in a different country, and maybe partly the connection we had was just circumstantial, based on the fact that we were both traveling at the same time, and there was this kind of freedom that came with that. She had just as much to do with it not working as I did. I can't take entirely the blame. It was as much her as it was me. And now I've come back, and I actually feel really quite liberated in a way. I feel really positive that I was able to have met her and enjoyed spending some time with her. And now I feel content to continue going about my life and maybe meet other people who I have similar kinds of deep connections with. But this kind of mind state, this ability to kind of see the positives in even things which ostensibly are really hard, is something that just requires time and patience and dedication. And I've, as I said, been kind of practicing this for about 8 years. And what I would say, though, is that it keeps getting better, if you like. It's a lifelong journey, but every step you make on this journey is a good one and leads towards a kind of deeper fulfillment. So it's ultimately, I think, what life is all about.
Yeah, that's quite interesting. I was thinking. I've been thinking for a while about fate and whether fate exists, and I don't necessarily think it is fate, but if you're in a position where you're taking risks and and you're thinking positive about things. So one of the stories I tell is I ran a business for quite a few years, and there was one point where my tax was due, so I had to pay my VAT. I think it was my VAT. And yeah, so the day, maybe 3 days before, I didn't have the money to pay the VAT. It wasn't going to happen. I didn't have the money, and maybe in a bit of a stressful position.
Yeah.
But a day before the VAT or the VAT was due, money arrived in my bank account from a client that I didn't assume would pay. And this, I mean, this is the positive thinking where, if in a negative light, I would have thought, oh man, I was so close. Like, this is so bad. I need to stop myself from getting in this position again.
Yeah.
But in my positive light is, oh, that's lucky. Nothing is, in a way to express it better, fucked. There's no position I feel I can be in where my whole life is going to end. The worst case scenario is I move to a friend's house and live on the sofa if anything doesn't work.
Yeah. And there are people, I saw a really interesting talk once which talked about, it said, it gave 3 examples of 3 different people. One of them was the person who was the 5th Beatle, who wasn't in the Beatles, but who was originally in the band and then left before they got famous. One of them was, I think, somebody who, I think he invented a toy but didn't patent it or something like this, and lost like $1 billion. Could have been a billionaire. And another person was wrongly imprisoned for maybe 10 years, and then eventually released when they realized that this person didn't do it. And the person who was giving the talk said, gave quotations from all 3 people, and all of them said that these negative things that had happened to them had changed their lives for the better. And the guy's summary was that, therefore, if you want to be extremely happy, don't be in the world's biggest rock band, don't make £1 million, and get locked up in jail for 10 years for a crime you didn't commit. Now, of course, it's tongue-in-cheek, it's a joke, but you think if people can do that and make positives out of things that, at least in the eyes of society, would be considered really negative, then you and I can make something good out of, a small occurrence when somebody doesn't phone us back. You know what I mean? It's these little daily things don't need to bog us down. But of course, as I said before, it requires patience with oneself. The path to self-compassion requires a degree of self-compassion because it's hard,
Okay, actually, quickly before we because we can just ramble on all day, really. I want to kind of go back to centeredness and, ego, bringing ego into this. So obviously you're improving yourself. You're in a way being selfish because you're just concentrating on who you are. Where does ego and lack of ego, where does this sort of cut into here? So you're working on yourself. Do you understand what I mean? So it's kind of building your ego, but then obviously you want to shed that ego as well.
Yeah, I understand. So it's the shedding of the ego is the process, and I can go into this in a little bit more depth. But one thing to consider is why. I think a really important question to ask is, why do we feel down about ourselves? The ego is ultimately, it's in my kind of practice, my philosophy of Zen Buddhism, the ego is not kind of a little demon that lives inside us. The ego is just a mistake. It's just a mistaken belief that we all fall into, a thought pattern that we all fall into, which ultimately says that we exist independently of the rest of the world, the rest of the universe. But, we only need to look at physics to recognize that this isn't true, that we are enmeshed in these infinite networks of cause and effect. And everything in the world kind of affects everything else. So when you're feeling down about yourself, it's worth considering that inherent in that is the belief in oneself as an independent being. So feeling low self-esteem is just as egotistical as feeling that you're better than other people. Essentially, feeling that you're worse than other people and feeling that you're better than other people are both egotistical decisions. This is it can be a bit hard to stomach because a lot of us look at people who are arrogant and say, oh, he's so egotistical. But actually, if we're feeling down about ourselves, we're just as egotistical. Ultimately, the process of self-compassion is the same process, identical to the process of compassion for others. It's one and the same thing. When we learn to forgive other people for their indiscretions, we can forgive ourselves for the same indiscretion. And actually, if you, this is an exercise everybody should do. Think of somebody who's committed a small indiscretion against you, perhaps hasn't returned a phone call or something like this. Somebody who you feel angry towards. Now, I would suggest that in every case, or at least most cases, the person you feel angry towards, you have some thought in your mind that's something along the lines of, I wouldn't do that in that situation. But how many times, if you really look back through your life, have you perhaps done that in that situation? When did you learn no longer to do it in that situation, no longer to act that way? Because the truth is that we feel angry oftentimes towards people for doing something where we've done it in the past and we haven't forgiven ourselves. You can forgive them for doing it and understand their motivations and why they did it. You can often look at yourself and say, actually, I can forgive myself for similar behaviors, for the times when I've acted in a similar way. And, this is happening to me very recently, especially with this girl I was just telling you about, where I've had to look and say, well, wait a minute. She acted towards me in ways that were quite, that was quite tough for me. And I sat and I thought about it, and I thought, now I know how those other people felt when I did that to them. And, and I can go and apologize to those people and say, you know what, I've been through that now. But at least now I can look at that and register that actually I probably hadn't forgiven myself for those things. I was perhaps even denying to myself that I'd caused any harm when on a deep level I knew that I had, and I wasn't forgiving myself. And now that I am looking at that and saying, okay, I understand that, I understand why I did that, I can look at her and say, well, I understand why she did that as well. What her motivations were, what fear she had, what desire she had, the kind of all the things that draw me away from my center. And consequently, the end result, the end goal, is this of self-compassion, is a sense of equality with all beings, with all people, and even with other, non-human beings. It's a sense of feeling equal, and even, and this is kind of a higher kind of higher end of things, even feeling at one on a kind of emotional level, if you like, feeling very much that you are as you should be, and in fact the world is as it should be. So the ego becomes completely relinquished, and we recognize that we are a part of a bigger system, if you like.
Yeah, thanks for that, Alex. So inspiredprimate.co.uk, that's your site, isn't it?
That's one of my sites, yeah, and I've also got, if people want to follow up and want to check out stuff, there's another good site to kind of look at is howtobeyourself.co.uk, and I'm going to put a PDF up there, a book that I've written that people can download. They don't need to give me an email address or anything like that. Just have it, read it, enjoy it. And if you have any questions, then just drop me an email. I love getting questions from people and responding and helping out in whatever way I can.
Excellent. Thank you very much for that, Alex. And we'll speak soon.